Is that you? Oh, no.
Welcome and good morning. It's good to be together. I'll begin by reading our centering thought. The global Indigenous cause reached a major milestone in 2007 when the UN General Assembly passed the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. Only 4 members of the Assembly voted in opposition, all of them Anglo-settler states, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. You should know that since that 4 years ago, that all 4 of those adopted the resolution. I will ring the bell to bring us into our states.
Good morning. My name is Gilmour, and I am a deacon here at First Church in Dedham. I've been a deacon for 12 years, and this is my last year. Can you hear me?
You have to be really close to the microphone.
I'll start over. Better? I'm almost never told I don't have a loud voice, so this is really a first. And if you can't hear me, we are in big trouble. I started by saying that I'm Gilmour, and I am one of 3 deacons here at First Church. I am in my 12th and final year as a deacon. So all of you are looking for a wonderful opportunity for service at First Church. Might think about becoming a deacon next year. Wherever you are in your journey, you are welcome, of course, here at First Church. We encourage religious freedom, and we welcome everyone here to join us for our Thanksgiving service. The parish committee is working on a new long-range plan. We want to thank everyone who has taken part in the conversation already, and we would like to encourage more feedback from the congregation, and the ministry committee has added 2 more conversations. Actually, one has already occurred, but one is also occurring today after church. If you haven't participated, please consider doing so, because everyone's input, of course, is important. We want to remind you that the Holly Fair, fun events and great traditions here at First Church will be on the first Saturday in December. It will have a new incarnation because we are co-sponsoring it with the Alamo Church, and we will be largely on the green, though the trading post will be in the auditorium. So, believe it or not, you're going to have that opportunity to dig into your closets and your attics and bring back treasures to First Church. Maybe even ones that you purchased at the trading post in a former holiday fair. Also, please save the date for the John Muratori concert on December 18th. It's a very beautiful classical guitar concert, and in the quiet and sort of semi-darkness of this meeting house, it is absolutely magical. So please encourage family and friends in this safe and masked environment to have a really wonderful Christmas celebration. So watch church emails, watch for the church weekly newsletter, and join us during this holiday season. Thank you.
Morning. The opening words today are A Hidden Heart by Jacqueline Keeler. I see in the first Thanksgiving story a hidden pilgrim heart. The story of that heart is the real tale that needs to be told. What did it hold? Bigotry, hatred, greed, self-righteousness? We have seen the evil that it caused in the 350 years since: genocide, environmental devastation, poverty, world wars, racism. Where is the hero that will destroy that heart of evil? I believe it must be each of us. Indeed, when I give thanks this Thursday and I cook my native food, I will be thinking of this hidden heart and how my ancestors survived the evil it caused. Because if we can survive with our ability to share and give intact, then the evil and the good that met that Thanksgiving Day in the land of the Wampanoag will have come full circle, and the healing can begin.
I light our chalice today for the first Thanksgiving, which is a myth and a imagination that we can reshape to be more inclusive and more understanding. And I light our green sanctuary candle with our rechargeable lighter to celebrate all the ways we strive to be a more sustainable congregation. I invite you now to sing with me hymn number 68 in your great hymnal, number 68, Come, Ye Thankful People, Come. order of service.
Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, to serve humanity in love is our covenant with each other and with God.
He means. Sorry. I'm doing a lot of this these days. So let's begin by centering ourselves. And there's a ladybug on the microphone. Centering ourselves and bringing ourselves into this space. Today our children are staying with us for the service, and if I just want to remind you that there are pew pals in the back if you need them, or if you want to listen from the back because you need to move around, that's a good place to go to. It's piped out there so you can hear everything. Our intergenerational story this morning is an excerpt from This Land is Their Land by David J Silverman. What do you think they mean by their land? Anybody have a guess? Whose land was this?
Native American.
What?
Native American.
The Native Americans, thank you. Yeah, the people who were here first. The American holiday of Thanksgiving had become associated with an origin myth in which Wampanoags played an important supporting role. Yet, that was not always the case. During the 18th century and the first half of the 19th, Thanksgiving had no link whatsoever with Pilgrims and Indians. It was a regional holiday, observed only in the New England states or those in the Midwest, to which New Englanders had migrated. Individual states decided whether and when they would hold the holiday, though the traditional time was late November to mark the close of the agricultural year. The so-called First Thanksgiving, as a 1621 gathering of the English colonists and Wampanoags, has come to be known, but was not the root of this holiday. Thanksgiving celebrations had emerged ironically out of the English Puritan practice of declaring feast days of prayer to mark some special mercy or judgment from God. Running from one afternoon to the next, these feast days, or days of Thanksgiving, centered on church-going, solemnity and piety, not gluttony and sport, though they usually concluded at sundown on the second day with a community feast. Gradually, during the colonial era, New Englanders began to hold days of Thanksgiving annually, each spring and autumn, instead of episodically, and the fasting became less strictly observed. How many of you fast before you have a big feast on Thanksgiving? Or go to church before you have a big feast? For a whole day? The character of holiday began to change around the time of the Civil War in 1863. President Abraham Lincoln declared that the last Thursday of November should be held as a national day of Thanksgiving, apparently in response to intense lobbying by Sarah Joseph Hale, the editor of Godly's Lady's book. Hale believed that the observance would foster unity amid the horrors of the Civil War. Afterward, the tradition stuck, with some modifications to the date, and gradually it spread to the South too. Around the same time, Americans began to think of the holiday as originating in a feast between the English colonists of Plymouth and the surrounding Indians. The first suggestion that such a link existed appears to date around 1841, when Reverend Alexander Young published the only primary source account of that event, consisting of a mere paragraph of 4 lines. To it, Young added an influential footnote, perhaps the first and only influential footnote in history, stating that this was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England. Over the next 50 years, various authors, artists, and lecturers disseminated Young's idea until Americans took it for granted. The lionization of pilgrims also grew out of Plymouth town's attempt to drum up civic pride and tourism. We're not going to sing you to your classes, so I invite you into a time of prayer or meditation as is your practice. Let us be grateful for all the silences in our lives, for with them we may more completely experience sound.
The first reading today is an excerpt from an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. The Columbus myth suggests that from U.S. independence onward, colonial settlers saw themselves as part of a world system of colonization. Columbia, the poetic Latinate name used in reference to the United States from its founding throughout the 19th century, was based on the name of Christopher Columbus. The land of Columbus was, and still is, represented by the image of a woman in sculptures and paintings, by institutions such as Columbia University, and by countless place names, including the National Capital, the District of Columbia. The 1798 hymn, Hail Columbia, was the early national anthem and is now used whenever the Vice President of the United States makes a public appearance. And Columbus Day is still a federal holiday, despite Columbus never having set foot in any territory ever claimed by the United States. Traditionally, historians of the United States, hoping to have successful careers in academia and to author lucrative school textbooks, became protectors of this origin myth. With the cultural upheavals in the academic world during the 1960s, engendered by the civil rights movement and student activism, historians came to call for objectivity and fairness in revising interpretations of U.S. history. They warned against moralizing, urging instead a dispassionate and culturally relative approach. Historian Bernard Shaheen, in an influential essay, called for a cultural conflict understanding of Native Euro-American relations in the early United States, writing that this approach diffuses the locus of guilt. In striving for balance, however, historians spouted platitudes. There were good and bad people on both sides. And American culture is an amalgamation of all of its ethnic groups. A frontier is a zone of interaction between cultures not merely advancing European settlements. Later, the trendy postmodernist studies insisted on indigenous agency under the guise of individual and collective empowerment, making the casualties of colonialism responsible for their own demise. Perhaps the worst of all, some claimed, and still claim, that the colonizer and colonized experienced an encounter and engaged in dialogue, thereby masking reality with justifications and rationalizations. In short, apologies for one-sided robbery and murder. In focusing on cultural change and conflict between cultures, these studies avoid fundamental questions about the formation of the United States and its implications for the present and future. This approach to history allows one to safely put aside present responsibility for the continued harm done by that past and the question of reparations, restitutions, and reordering society. our beloved kin, A New History of King Philip's War by Lisa Brooks. In the heat of July, Pocasset families would have been living on the coast and ponds, fishing, gathering shellfish, harvesting plants from the salt and cedar marshes, and returning periodically to check the growth of their planting fields. To the west of the Nonoquackets, planting grounds on the Neck, their English neighbor, Richard Morris, with their permission, left his cow to graze on the copious salt marsh grasses. The cows confined by water on both sides of the peninsula. Yet summer was not all subsistence, but a season of diplomacy. While a unique Indian deed dated July 26, 1651, allowed Richard Morris to inhabit a tract of land on the Nuniquockets or Pocasset Neck. The document also mapped crucial Indigenous relationships. It also recorded a council among the sachems, Indigenous diplomatic rhetoric intertwining with English legal discourse. The deed signals the ways in which leaders like Usamiquin and Namampam had begun to adapt the tool of writing to play a role similar to wampum, the powerful shell bead which bound people together and bound words to deeds. Adhering to traditional protocols, the sachems opened their statement by invoking bonds of kinship, the framework on which governance rested, declaring they were of the blood and kindred of Namampam. Algonquin languages express kinship through pronouns like my, our, and his. Yet these terms do not denote possession, but rather evoke responsibilities and shared histories that bind people to each other and the land. Every pronouncement of kinship invoked a bond. While the Nigwes, my mother, evoked the birth cord that connects the infant to its mother, Nadakina, our land, evokes the cord that ties the people to our nourishing motherland. Moreover, these terms embed inclusivity and exclusivity. To Usamiquin and his neighboring sachems, Namampam was my kinsman, our cousin, as well as his brother's daughter. Deceptively simple words which, like wampum, bound their expression of reciprocal kinship to their deeds. Yet, his words also drew bounds around our land, making clear that those outside the bonds of kinship, in this case, the Plymouth settlers, could claim neither Weetaboo nor her land as their own. In the deed, Usamiquin, the leader, recognized as Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag, and Plymouth's most valuable ally, spoke with reverence for his kinswoman, insisting he commanded neither obedience nor authority in the territory of her inheritance. Further, Usamiquin stated, I never did nor intend to put under Plymouth any of my kinswoman's land, but my own inheritance, and therefore I do disallow of any pretended claim to this land, marking a clear boundary between Plymouth's pretended assertions and Namampam's jurisdiction. Usamiquin expressed Namampam's exclusive relationship to Pocasset, a symbolic representation of the collective right of Pocasset families, which he was obliged to respect as her kinsman and neighbor. Indeed, one crucial function of summer councils and this written instrument was to cement and clarify relationships between neighboring peoples and their territories, including settlers. Would you please stand as you're willing and able and join us in singing hymn number 160 in the great and felt far too long by fear divided.
Please be seated. Several Unitarian Universalist churches and those of other denominations say something akin to the words of mass action at the beginning of their services. We are committed to honoring the sovereignty of First Nations peoples. We acknowledge that we are on traditional and unceded lands of the Massachusetts, Mohegan, Nasset, Nipmuc, Pawtucket, Potomac, Wabanaki Confederacy, and Wampanoag peoples. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples still living in these lands. In making this acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, and we commit to dismantling the systems of oppression that have displaced Indigenous peoples. We believe that we are called to name the crimes committed by colonial settlers against Indigenous people and work to dismantle the systems of oppression that continue to harm Black, Indigenous, and people of color to this day. I have often wondered what it would be required for us to acknowledge that we worship on land that once belonged to the Wampanoag, Massasoit, and Aponsa people, who harmoniously and freely roamed these lands for countless ages, right up until the English settlers who landed in Dedham on the shores of the Charles River, not even a mile from this church in 1636. While our church dates back to 1638, the Neponset and Wampanoag and Massasoit people have a centuries-older claim to this property and this place, as if our only conflict was between 1818 and 1820. At the time of the Dedham decision, we tell a history that starts after that many people already settled here. When we consider the native people's origins in this place, our story seems sort of egocentric. I imagine this statement of conscience would require at least a commitment from the parish committee, if not a vote from the entire congregation, because we affirm and promote the democratic process. After all, I can stand up here and say whatever I want. I have a free pulpit, and you have a free pew, but I cannot put words in your mouth or tell you what to believe. Isn't expecting others to communicate and believe what you believe exactly what the English settlers were asking from the native peoples? And wasn't that also what the original founders of First Church originally intended? To the English settlers, only contracts that were written down and in court made binding and everlasting. To the indigenous peoples of this land, only spoken contracts based on mutual respect and compacted with wampum beads were binding. Imagine the conflict there. As Lisa Brooks points out in her new take on the King Philip's War, the cultural differences between the English and American Indians led to great misunderstandings and conflict. The most glaring blindness of the English settlers was that they were unable to recognize Weedamoo, a female leader, as possessing any authority whatsoever. Keep in mind, these same English ministers and teachers and lawyers and politicians ran a pregnant Anne Hutchinson out of Boston in 1637 to Rhode Island because she was teaching Bible study to women who were not allowed in church. And remember that even married women could not own property as late as 1848, nearly 200 years after the King Philip's War. It was in fact completely impossible for the English negotiators to recognize the ownership of a female leader, and even difficult for historians to downplay those misunderstandings that came out of a gender subjugation that affected English negotiations for land with indigenous peoples who had no such prejudice against women or need for absolute land ownership. Native people in this land formed their bonds on kinship, not ownership. Imagine the difference between thinking someone as your family member, your kin, and thinking of them as instead of being in relationship to the land and to the people around you who actually own and set up walls. There's an inherent disconnect there. As we celebrate Thanksgiving, I think it's vital for us to recognize that as much as we might like turkey and football games and the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, the Pilgrim Story is just propaganda formed after the Civil War to unify an origin story of America that set up a system of castes and creeds. Sadly, the fairy tale instead glorified the Pilgrim intruders and fails to make sense of the true kinship the Wampanoag and the Ponset Valley people offered at the time of the Pilgrim settlers' landing. Take, for example, the indigenous response to the Puritan invasion. First, they offered them wampum, blue and white beads made from shells, which stood as their currency. When the native people in this land realized that the new English people did not understand their form of contract, several of their ambassadors learned to read and write in English, so as to enter into contracts in the method that was more familiar to the new settlers. Not only that, but it was the indigenous tradition to give over their children, one or two of their children, to other tribes to aid in communication between different cultures. Imagine how different that is than how most of us deal with different cultures this day. Many of us don't learn Spanish to go visit Mexico or Spain, or learn a language of our housekeepers or gardeners to aid in communication. The indigenous people were willingly offered some of their children to be educated in the schools of white men as early as the first schools were founded in the U.S. However, the intention of this striking action was entirely lost on the white men legislators who believed they were superior to the native people, rather than responding with a similar gesture with connection and attempt to understand as the goal. The Puritans went on to force more native children into residential schools all through colonial times and into the 19th century. These so-called Christian efforts to educate the natives were nothing more than efforts to indoctrinate the natives into an English way of life. Sure, there have almost always been celebrations of harvest in all parts of the earth by indigenous people, and feasting and fast days were common to the Pilgrims too. It's just that no real feast was had by the native peoples and their invaders on the fourth Thursday in November. From the beginning, the Pilgrims built walls of separation between themselves and the natives of this land. The school that was on this property, the first public school, had a watchtower so they could keep watch to make sure of no Indian invasion to their school. English laws also consistently displayed the English views of life as superior in all ways. The English settlers perceived the kinship that existed between Gilmour and Massasoit, that the two offered freely to the English settlers, as a weakness and something to be dismissed and ignored. The English settlers believed that the native inhabitants of these lands were inferior heathens, and created all kinds of misunderstandings that led to intractable conflicts and centuries of subjugation, not a dinner with a turkey and stuffing. As we approach this Thanksgiving season, I hope we can celebrate the food and where it comes from. All the many hands that grew it and raised it and brought it to the stores, as well as the hands that prepared it. In the same way, I hope we can always offer thanks and honor the indigenous people who were all but erased in this settling of this country we call home. In fact, the last native person in Dedham in the 19th century was buried where Legacy Place now stands. And they just steamrolled right over her gravesite. Let us not continue to be colonizers as our ancestors were, but strive to treat all people with inherent worth and dignity. Let us treat people that seem different from ourselves with curiosity and compassion, knowing that every tradition holds a piece of the truth. Perhaps our fairy tale of Thanksgiving can start to serve as a reminder of the ways we want to live into the future. Because we will never be able to turn back the clock and right all the many wrongs our ancestors have wrought. What we can do is become more and more aware and honest about how we got where we are now. Maybe so. fix our steps so we stagger not in the uneven motions of this world, but go steadily on our way, neither censuring our journeys by the weather we meet or turning aside from anything that might befall us. Amen.